Hi everybody, I'm Luke Plowman from Detail Green, and today I'm going to be talking to you about my perspective on being involved in the passive house industry for the last 5 years or so. Today, being a virtual conference, I'm coming to you from our office here in Beechworth. So Detail Green's based in Beechworth in North East Victoria, and our passive house team these days involves three of us, and we're also two building designers. So we work generally in the passive house space, doing building passive house design and building certification. So today, anyway, I'm going to be speaking about the I guess since my journey through passive house of the last 5 years. Started a little bit before then, but I guess since attending the first passive house conference in Auckland in 2015, I guess I've observed some big changes in the passive house, the growth of passive house across the South Pacific. So I'm going to talk briefly about how it's grown locally, some successful and unsuccessful approaches, or less successful approaches, to achieving the passive house air tightness standard on residential projects. What really happens in residential passive house certification, and that's really just a very brief overview because a lot of people are a little bit unclear on what we do. And also, I'm going to talk about give you some case studies of what happens. What some good projects I guess we've been involved in, that ones that you may not have heard about through this conference or other media so far. So 2015, what were we talking about? Back then there was only the first few projects in Australia. First couple that I was involved in, the picture here is of one in Yarra Glen out of Melbourne. Really, we were considering the feasibility. What does a passive house look like in the South Pacific in our climate? How do we deal with bushfires? How do we build an airtight building? It was such a big challenge for us back then. We're getting much better at it these days. And availability of products, airtight windows, heat recovery ventilation systems that are certifying. Does it all really work, and what does that mean for Australia? So what were we talking about back then? In 2016, this is a slide from my presentation at the 2016 conference. It was about being involved in what was, I guess, potentially going to be Australia's first Passive House Plus. It ended up being Australia's second Passive House Plus. The location, you can just sort of see there, is about 4 hours west of Brisbane on the New South Wales-Brisbane border, on the western side of the Great Divide. I worked in conjunction with Sustainable Building Design on this project. Very simple building, very particular client, wanted an off-grid and fossil fuel-free house. You can see from the numbers from the PHPP some really impressive numbers there, which is great for an off-grid house. Very minimal heating and cooling required. So in 2020, how is it going? The picture at the top there shows us the Springdale project and how it looks finished. You can see the PV array in the back corner there. So generally, it's functioning quite well, although we've had a bit of contact over the last 4 years with the owners. There's a couple of things. Firstly, it used an uncertified HRV system, which was initially very noisy and had to be recommissioned. And it eventually got working to a level that the clients were satisfied with it, but tricky being a very remote location, getting a contractor who could help them with that. One of the really interesting things we've discovered of late is with changing weather patterns, or this last 12 months being a little bit different, in both peak summer and peak winter, that owners are finding that they've had to be very careful with their energy usage because their supplies run out after a couple of days of no sunshine. So they had to be very frugal with using their heating and cooling system. And the chart here at the bottom of the page shows you in winter this year, in June, over a cold, cloudy, damp period, where the external temperature didn't get above 10 degrees, the house temperature slowly trickled down to 15, and they were unable to turn the heating on due to the lack of solar or energy available in their battery system. Interestingly, I guess in summer, they have the opposite problem, where they have found that even though the house is well shaded and has shutters on all the windows, they still have overheating, and at times they've had to minimize their air conditioning use due to, once again, battery energy levels running low. The particular climate is overcast more in summer than in winter. So one of the issues I think we've identified is with the HRV system is that there's quite an amount of air leakage around the HRV cabinet, which is leading to some unwanted heat gains. But generally speaking, 3 out of 4 years has been very good. The house has been functioning absolutely well. It's just in those peak periods where they've where they've struggled a bit, not in terms of building performance, but in lack of energy. So I think a generator is on the cards. But it was quite ambitious to try and go a few years with no generator at all. So a few numbers for you on growth of passive house in Australia. 2015, when I was doing my first few projects, all our projects were using building certifiers from overseas, from Ireland, Canada, and the Passive House Institute in Germany. 2016, Claire and Jason and I all did the building certifiers course together, and I picked up one project that year as a building certifier as it commenced. In 2017, the Monash commercial building in Melbourne commenced, and I had 9 certifications on the books by the end of 2017. 2018, I finished my first certification project, and we picked up 13 new projects that year. So things are starting to pick up. In 2019, there's really steady growth. The Fern was completed. Gillies Hall, Monash University also completed. We were at 17 new projects for certification. This is in 2020, we have on the books at the end of August 23 new projects on the go, which is fantastic. We're really starting to see a rise of benefit projects. Great to see some more of those finished. At the moment, we have 46 projects under certification, 9 completed, and another 5 projects where I've been working as a passive house designer. So things are really taking off. We're even getting a few, I guess, hotspots rather than just a smattering. Some real hotspots of passive house. Central Victoria, just out of Melbourne, just north of Melbourne, up to the Castlemaine, Daylesford region is quite a lot happening there. Northeast Victoria around here, Beechworth, Wangaratta, Bright, there's a lot happening. Inner North Melbourne suburbs, Northcote sort of zone, lots happening. Canberra as always, right from the start. Canberra's been a hotspot for passive house, and really some interesting growth in Sydney and southwest Western Australia. Fantastic to see passive house stretching into those climates as well. Also, a number of larger projects, hotel accommodation projects we're working on as the certifiers, and a peer review for a large community building in Melbourne. Also, passive house heading north to Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast, so slowly but surely creeping to those warmer, more humid climates. So, and as we've already heard over the last few days, there's some phenomenal growth of passive house in China, British Columbia, New York, and as always in Europe. The last 5 years, we've grown from just a few local projects to easily more than 200 alone in Australia. And I guess what's contributed to that, in my opinion, I think some of it is the seeing is believing. And the Passive House Open Days, I think, are a fantastic way for people to see that. It's really great whenever we have a potential client go to see one, they always come back and say, yes, that's definitely what we want. So yeah, they're great. Growing concern about climate change is really starting to push a few more people this way, and just getting people reading more about how they can use less energy. Great to see. I definitely think the last few months, the COVID lockdown has had a lot of people in Melbourne go, oh my goodness, my house is cold and I can't go to Queensland this year. There's definitely factoring something into it. And also the Green Star tool, for those of you who've been involved in green buildings like I have since the early 2000s, once the Green Star standard came out, once you've experienced one, there's no going back. And Passive House, as we all know, anyone who's enthusiastic about Passive House knows that once you're there, there's no going back. Also, the great sharing by the Passive House community is always fantastic. It happens here, it happens all over the world. It's a really great way that people open up their houses and their ideas, and everybody shares, and we get more and more buildings. Fantastic. Which is also good about sharing, is also good about dispelling myths and showing real data of how buildings are performing. So, working as a passive house consultant, which we do quite a lot of, I guess in the last couple of years, we've seen a real interest in people who are dipping their toe in the water and looking for a feasibility study, or just to implement some passive house principles in their building, which is a big step up from just minimal code compliance. Collaboration between the design team and the builder is certainly, in our experience, the most successful approach to a project. Practice and experience helps. The more experienced the design and construction team, the smoother it goes. That's definitely a big factor there. And once you get through your first few projects, it's all good, goes well from there. And retrofits, whilst with a simple building, they may appear easy on paper initially. In reality, they're actually quite hard. So one of the other elements that we do at Detail Green is air tightness testing on residential projects. So here's a couple of slides on some do's and don'ts, things that do work and don't work in our experience. The project on the left in the picture here is the first passive house from Beechworth, and builder's first attempt, which received a really fantastic 0.48 air changes at its final test, which is good for a 110 square meter building. You'll notice here the absolutely perfect installation of the Intello membranes. Did an absolutely incredible job with this project, not a crease to be found anywhere, and quite a novel approach to creating a services cavity across the ceiling in this sort of kitchen living space. So really some things that do work in the design phase is really for the designers to be thinking about construction sequencing and the location of the membrane and making sure that everything is as clean and simple and easy to install for the builders as possible. Also considering what should the airtight layer be. Should it be a membrane such as in this project, or plywood or OSB or something similar to that? And what works in construction, I guess, very careful attention to detail. You know, we're trying to achieve a very high airtightness standard, a huge leap from most local construction, I think both in Australia and New Zealand. So attention to detail is absolutely critical. Thinking through the construction sequencing, including the envelope and services rough-in, is really important to achieving a good airtightness result. Also, I guess in some of our experiences, don't leave it too late to do your first test. Particularly for first-time projects, is I wouldn't rough in the HRV or electrics or plumbing until you've done a test on the membrane, because once those services are in, it is very hard to find leaks behind them if there are leaks. And then also, if you do get a fantastic preliminary test result, don't relax too much. We've had a few projects where after an excellent preliminary result, the final test has either failed or gone very, very close to not passing. So diligence throughout the construction process is absolutely necessary. Also, on a couple of SIPS projects we've tested, we've found the builders actually really liked because of the robustness of the OSB compared to a flexible membrane, a little bit more expensive. But if it can be designed and constructed in an airtight manner, yeah, like a solid plywood, SIPS, OSB provide a really good airtightness layer. So a few things not to do. The pictures here tell 1,000 words. The one on the top left is fairly obvious. You don't want your membrane to look like Swiss cheese and have to be taped up quite as much as in that particular picture. The picture with the window, you can see quite a big crease in the membrane behind where they put the battens on, prone an obvious area where we regularly find leaks, which are also very difficult to tape up if there's creases in the membrane. The third picture was a real surprise. We'd been testing this project for a day and a half and couldn't work out where we're getting such high leakage. It was only after pulling our hair out for almost 2 days that we thought, well, let's tape the floor and see if that's leaking, because we've tested everything else. And it's not all that clear in the picture, but that piece of Intello taped to the floor did billow up about 20 centimeters. So air was being drawn easily through a 17 millimeter layer of OSB. That's a really interesting finding. So in that project, in the end, they ended up painting the floor with a waterproofing membrane like you would use in a shower or a substrate for a shower, and that fixed the problem. The other one to be really careful of is where you're using external external insulation. So this project has a 90mm stud with Intello membrane and then external insulation over the top. And the builders who like to put in lots of screws to make sure things don't fall down is good, but every screw creates a tiny little hole, which can lead to air leakage, let alone the thermal bridging associated with a whole lot of screws going through a layer there. If you're using spray foam as your airtight layer, it needs to be installed absolutely perfectly for it to be airtight. We've had a couple of projects, and yes, if it's not done properly, it will definitely leak, so be careful there. Sloppy workmanship obviously is a key ingredient to not passing blow-it-all test. It must be done very, very carefully. Fireplaces and flues and air intake pipes for fireplaces are really difficult from thermal bridging as well as air tightness, and really generally a passive house doesn't need a fireplace, so I'd advise not to put one in. Put an outside fire pit in if you want a fireplace. Trying to retrofit services through an airtight layer when the building's nearly finished, putting the TV aerial on, not a good idea. Try and do it, think about it and get it done well before your airtight membrane is covered up. So passive house certification, I'm just going to touch on this just briefly, just to give you a sense of what we do in the certification process. So what is it all about? Primarily, it's about quality assurance. The passive house standard requires a certified building to be reviewed by somebody independent, a building certifier, to make sure that the designer hasn't made any obvious mistakes. This also is a fantastic piece of peace of mind for owners or stakeholders in the project. Just knowing that things have been reviewed and somebody else has had a look over your work is always comforting to know that what you've done is correct. Particularly with something complicated like the PHPP, it's good to have someone look it over. It's very easy to make a mistake, even for those of us who use it every day. So part of that certification process, particularly for new passive house designers, is providing a bit of tuition on how to enter things correctly into the PHPP. Quite commonly, there's a number of common mistakes that, regularly need a bit of tuition. Also, reassurance for passive house designers is a big part of certification. We get a lot of designers calling us up saying we're just trying to convince our clients to go for certification because we want to make sure that what we've done is correct. We want you to check our work. So that's great, and that's what we're here to do. We're here to help, and here to help you get your passive house project certified. And I guess the other bit there, the other thing that certification is quite good for is making sure the builder doesn't take any shortcuts. And perhaps that's one of the big differences between a non-certified and a certified building, is that you can be sure that what's on paper has been translated into the finished product. So, a bit of what, why, and how. There are over 100 building certifiers around the world, and you can use any of them to certify your passive house project. Claire, Jason, and I service the South Pacific, and most building certifiers stick to their region, but you're free to use any that you like. The role of certifier, as I mentioned before, is providing quality assurance through design and construction process. The key tasks we do is checking that the PHP entries are accurate and backed up with drawings, data sheets, and photos. And also, construction documentation checks that things have been built as they were designed. Site inspections are not 100% necessary. We all like to go to site, but quite often in cost-pressured residential projects, it's not that common that we do go to site unless they're quite close to where we live and work. So, depending on the experience of the design and construction team, certification can be done in either 1, 2, or 3 steps. The most common approach is 3 steps, where we do a preliminary assessment in schematic design, just to make sure there are no major errors in the PHPP and everything's looking on track for compliance to Passive House standard. A vast majority of the certification work is ideally done prior to construction commencing. Ideally, we can review all your documents, all your data sheets, all your thermal bridge models, everything, so we can tick off 70 to 80% of the documentation before the project started. That way, everyone can be confident that the building should make certification. The final assessment is done at the end of construction, confirming any final details and changes. So, a few case studies to talk about some successful projects that you may not have heard about. This is the first passive house in northeast Victoria, in Mount Beauty, with a beautiful view of Mount Bogong in the background you can see there. Every single house in this valley faces east to get the view of Mount Bogong, so not so good from a passive solar design in a climate that can be both hot and cold. This project used SIPS construction, you can see from the pictures, concrete slab on ground, quite a lot of insulation because we get quite cold, it snows occasionally, and also gets to 40 degrees in summer. The clients in this house are very particular and very insistent, even as much as I tried to tell them they would need some heating and cooling, they haven't installed any. They've been in the house nearly a year. The first winters, they're just about through it. And you can see from the charts there that it's got down to about 16 degrees a few times when it's been 5 degrees outside for a couple of days. And in summer, at hottest it got, surprisingly, it was only 27 degrees in a heat wave in January. Triple glazing, quite a lot of insulation there you can see. Fantastic job by builder, his first passive house. This is the first passive house in Beechworth, which was certified just recently. It has quite a high form factor. It's a retirement house for a couple, 110 square meters, and you can see it's got, it was a passive solar design that we adapted to passive house. So volume, I guess, form factor wasn't considered in the initial design, but we managed to get it over the line. Heaps of insulation because Beechworth is cold, very much like Canberra in winter. High performance triple glazing, fantastic work by the builder on his first passive house building. This uses external insulation on a 90mm stud, fully insulated concrete slab. A retrofit project in Northcote. This one is a really interesting project that we've been involved in for a number of years now. And I guess quite typical of what is done, certainly in Australia, in renovation projects in sort of inner city, where you've got an old house that may be heritage listed at the front, as this one was, knock down the back of the house and build a brand new house at the back, but retain those front few rooms. The challenge there is making sure that you can retrofit that existing building to make it airtight. And in this case, they pretty much pulled the whole thing to pieces to insert the airtight layer on the inside of the existing stud-work. Plus, there was a lot of straightening up to be done and fixing. It's so far got very close, 1.1 air changes. So there's talk of a little bit more work to be done, and hopefully this one could be certified as an NF at some stage in the future. Project was a first-time project for both the architect and the builder. So quite a challenge. The built-in fireplace was a challenge, as they always are, with an airtight flue. Unfortunately, and I guess a lesson for all of us through this was that during the construction phase, the builder had been given some advice that he could change over the rigid foam insulation for 2 layers of reflective insulation. And he only told me this after he'd gone ahead and done it on the ground floor. I raised my concerns. We had a woofie analysis done and proved that it would fail, so it had to be all pulled out and replaced with the proper insulation. So very important to let your builders know, don't change anything without first checking with the Passive House designer. This building has a slightly better form factor than the last two that I showed you of 3.3. Still required triple glazed windows, quite a lot of overshadowing. The slab was insulated on top instead of underneath, just because that's the way they wanted to do it. Once again, a 90mm stud with external insulation, quite a lot of insulation to the roof. And the photo in the bottom right corner is the restored front of the heritage house with brand new windows. Thornley project, I know Andy Muller has already spoken about this. I really just wanted to say, Sydney, how easy it is. Is it? Fantastic. A mild climate means that with good solar orientation, achieving Passive House is really not too much of a stretch. Obviously, your building must be airtight and thermal bridge free, but you could almost get by with code compliant insulation levels. So I think that's quite exciting. That means we could build, for minimal cost premium, lots of Passive House buildings across the sort of the Sydney or in that area where we have a mild coastal climate. Interestingly, dehumidification is starting to become an issue once you get to Sydney and further north. They're doing some great monitoring on this building, so good to see how reality aligns with the technicalities of the Passive House standard. And I think a lot of people who live in Sydney would say that it's not that humid. But we know that our thermal comfort requirements in the Passive House standard are very strict, and it does say that we do need dehumidification at some stages during summer in Sydney. One of the things about these coastal climates is that winter and summer performance is quite equally balanced. So heating demand, cooling demand are quite similar. And when this wasn't a slab on ground project, but for the other Sydney projects where they are slab on ground, insulation generally not required. Here's a new project of ours, which we've really just sort of commenced on. It's 2 townhouses in Noosa, which is on the Sunshine Coast north of Brisbane. Starting to get into some really interesting territory in terms of quite a large latent cooling load in summer compared to the sensible load. These 2 townhouses, 2-story townhouses, we recently did the NATO, so the building code compliance modelling for. The north-facing one got 7.1 stars. The south-facing one just passed with 6.1 stars, but it meets the Passive House heating and cooling demand benchmarks. A very low G-value glass to try and reduce the overheating. Light colours, dehumidification definitely needed in this climate. Double glazed windows, which is great. We've also found, I guess, so far that introducing some psi values for some standard thermal bridges, which would make your project quite difficult in Victoria or Canberra, has seemingly have not so much impact on a much more milder climate. So once again, yeah, seemingly, I'm sure there will be other challenges with dehumidification, but the thermal envelope actually gets pretty easy in these sort of coastal climates. Great to see these ones get built in over the next 12 to 18 months. Here's another interesting one, West Wyalong. This is a project of ours which is just about to start construction. You can see the little red dot there is pretty much west of Sydney. It's about 3 hours northwest drive of Canberra on the western side of the Great Divide, just before Australia gets really hot and dry. It's sort of near Dubbo, for those of you who don't know that area. It has cool nights but very hot days in summer. These clients came to us with a concept design which we've drawn up. It's got good solar orientation, and we can get this to comply with the Passive House standard without too much difficulty, although it's quite interesting that even though it's hot, we're starting to get to the point where we need to increase the performance of the thermal envelope. Cold nights, really hot days. It does require insulation under the slab to try and keep that heat in during winter. Very low humidity in summer. So we've had to go to triple glazing, interestingly, to keep the heat in overnight. And also with a relatively low G value to try and stop too much overheating in summer. 140mm stud walls, which is pretty standard for a Passive House in southern Australia, and R7 insulation in the roof. So nothing too extreme, but yeah, I guess it's been quite an interesting project, and it'll be great to see this one get built. So a bit of a summary for my talk here. Our mild climate does allow quite a lot of design flexibility, particularly in the coastal regions from Perth around to Brisbane. I guess some comments from me standing back and looking at the projects as a building certifier. I think certainly our designers need to do a little bit of adaptive work to really make passive houses cost effective as possible. And one of the key things there is smaller windows. We love big windows, but as anyone who's been through a few projects will realize that big windows equals lots of overheating, and also they're very, very expensive. So slightly smaller windows is a good thing. More compact building forms, once again, same sort of thing. It's a historical way we've designed buildings, but the more compact they are, the easier they are to get there. And certainly don't throw away your passive design principles, no matter what somebody tells you. A good solar orientation makes it much easier regardless of the climate. External shading devices are an absolute must. Anywhere where it gets hot, you need to be able to keep that summer sun out, and horizontal eaves and awnings only do a certain amount. So vertical shading devices, external, is very common in passive houses. Quality windows, absolutely. Yeah, interesting that a lot of designers really don't understand what a great investment quality windows are. And keeping it simple is really, if you want to build a cost-effective passive house, the simpler it is, the easier it's going to be, both in terms of construction and cost. So it's really striking a balance between, I guess, for a lot of our architects and designers, providing an architectural statement and a building with high performance. So yeah, just in summary, the coastal climates around the southern part of the country, minimal additional insulation needs to reach passive house, which is really great. Hopefully we see a lot more buildings in these areas. In the colder, more inland areas, passive solar design principles and a compact building form is really important to keep that right. And always take care with the airtight membranes. There's no room for error in the airtightness requirements. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I just thought I'd end with our view in this sort of COVID lockdown world. It's nice to share a little bit of where you are, and this is our view in Beechworth on a winter's evening. Thanks very much.